Well, hello. Thank you so much for this opportunity, so much for this challenge. I've got to say, I find both of these texts bears to teach. I have taught them both. I've taught Huckfin many, many times, and a couple of times I've taken a swing at teaching James. I'm going to share with you some of the mistakes and some of the successes I've had, and I'm interested in asking you about some of your approaches. I have a slide show to sort of walk us through rather than, with notes for me to riff off. And I want to play around with some of those passages I know several of you had time to look at ahead of time. And if not, yeah, I'll project them on the screen so you can sort of catch up pretty quickly. So give me a moment and I'll get the slide open and we will get running. Okay, and play from start. There we go. Can you see my first slide?
Yes.
Lonnie's all good?
Yeah. Yes.
All right. Um, so I think one of the first things I want to address is this current moment, and why teaching during this current moment is complicated. I'm teaching at a big public Southern university, and times are tough, and there have been people videoing me in my classes. This is a complicated era we're in, and these texts don't shy away from that. These texts showcase that difficulty. They also show that reading matters. When people are really upset about a book, it's usually a place to start, not a place to stop. So that's sort of the spirit with which I am launching these ideas. But towards the end, I'd really love your thoughts about this moment and these texts. Um, so I have a little introduction. I want to do a little pedagogical shift from James to Huck Finn and back. Talk about some of the challenges, many of which you know the challenges, but I sort of wanted to outline them. I want to address one or two of, not all of those challenges, but some of them. And then I want to jump into sort of playing around with some of the passages with you, seeing where we land about how we might teach them, how that opens up questions and answers and questions again. And then we'll move into Q&A. So here we go. So first of all, I don't usually want to center myself that much in a class situation. But in this particular one, I want to tell you two little anecdotes before I launch into everything proper. One is which at the very beginning of my career, I don't know, 25 years ago, I was the Mark Twain Society Fellow. And it was a great, exciting moment. I was writing a chapter about Twain in my book, and I got to go up to Elmira, New York, and live in the Twain house. That's what they were doing then. I don't know if people do that still, but I got to live in the Twain house for a couple of weeks. I was all alone. It was a very strange, spooky, bizarre experience. And I had this very exciting career moment because Ken Burns had done the Mark Twain American Experience PBS series, and he had been working on it the previous year. But I got a call that summer from the caretakers saying, "Could you please move your computer away from the window? Some of the camera crew is coming back to the house, and they want to just get a couple of shots now that the light is different in the summer. It's not the whole crew, it's just some of the vision, just some of the images for the exterior shots. They're just sending." And I got very excited. I mean, the Ken Burns team. Oh my God. And so I got all ready. The next day they showed up and I chatted a little with one or two of the camera guys who were there just doing some shots. And they asked me what I was doing there. I said it was the scholar in residence for those weeks. And then when I went, well, you know what? Hey, let's ask you some questions and we'll film it. And I just thought, oh, my career is made. This is it. I'm going to be in a Ken Burns documentary. This is amazing. I ran inside, put on some lipstick, ran outside, sat down, and they got the camera centered. And they asked me a question. And I answered my very first question by saying, "Well, I'm not really a Mark Twain scholar." Now, was this self-effacement because of classic academic imposter syndrome? Yes. Is there also some gender things about not wanting to assert one's expertise? Yes. Was it also a problem of just being a young scholar? Yes. I mean, I was an expert on Twain, really. I mean, I had the fellowship, but the reason I answered that, and this is relevant, I think, is the Twain machine, right? The Twain machine is so enormous. I think, very, very few authors have the industry. Jane Austen, Shakespeare, Emily Dickinson, maybe. Mark Twain is probably there, where there's a massive popular audience and popular scholarship that sort of comes to bear on sort of the academic realm of a writer and its cultural impact. And I was so intimidated by that I almost felt I couldn't assert my expertise. And when we talk about students, rather than just jumping into Huck Finn, I really do think it's important for them too to be able to say, have they encountered it? Have they just heard of it? Do they know of it from osmosis? Huck Finn has a lot to do with identity formation for people in strange ways. I've lectured on Huck Finn to senior citizen organizations, a lot of library groups. I've done a lot of Huck Finn outreach. And I often get sort of older people saying, "Oh, I was a Huck Finn character." And yeah, I don't know how to respond to that. But I realize a lot of people really, a book they read as an adolescent particularly sinks in and stays with them and becomes part of their identity formation. And whether that's useful and you can harness that, or whether that is a problem that you should ask them to try to, question themselves on, I think bringing that, the weight of the Twain and the Huck Finn stuff into the classroom central is helpful. Um, and then the second thing I wanted to say personally is, so I have taught Huck Finn for many, many years. And what then I stopped, and I have recently come back to it because of James. And I like to talk to the students very explicitly about that journey I had as a teacher. And I think as a young scholar, I never would have articulated this to the public or to students, and I'm not even sure I was fully openly aware of it to myself. But I think I just thought, well, you know, people who are upset about Huck Finn don't understand irony. And if you understand irony, you can appreciate Huck Finn. I mean, I think I had that nasty little superior racist, just also and condescending attitude about people who found that novel really troubling. Not just because of the N word, but because whatever reason, I just sort of felt like this is a great thing, one of the great writings of American literature about irony, about humor. And yes, it's not perfect, but this is where we can ask all the hard questions. And so I sort of taught it like that for over a decade. Um, but it started to bother me more and more, and partially the N word made me, the more I taught about it, the less comfortable I became with it, even though I thought I was doing it sensitively and with nuance and with, interrogating the word, and classrooms are exactly where we interrogate hard language. And I became a little less easy with that comfort that I think I had, a little less arrogant about it. I also increasingly, I think, became uncomfortable with some of the messages about civilization, about women. Women seem to signify civilization and escaping family, escaping children, escaping love, escaping that which makes us complete is not freedom to me. And that often seemed to be at least a takeaway a lot of people were getting from that book. Um, and also I think it was being taught partially because I think young men can respond quite well to this novel, in a way that I think young women are less drawn one way or the other. And I think the gender was also playing into why it fit into a lot of teaching projects for me and for other people. So I began to become more self-aware of my discomfort and thinking I was not teaching it that effectively, and maybe I could walk away from it. So I sort of took it out of my survey classes. I took it out of my upper level American novel classes and sort of left it alone for a couple years. And I only came back to it, over this past year when teaching, first an American novel class where I penned Huck Finn and James, and then later at my American survey class where I sort of did the same. So, I don't know where Huck Finn is going to be landing with me for the future, but I think these are interesting conversations. Again, don't always want to center myself, but I think that kind of for Huck Finn in particular, as part of this keystone of American identity, it's important to be able to be honest with yourself about your teaching experiences of it, your reading experiences of it, and then ask students to sort of pull it out for themselves, whether they've read it or just heard about it. Um, Now, as for James, there are many, many challenges you're probably well aware of. There are a lot of assumptions. Jim was one sort of character in the first book. Is he going to be this kind of character in the next book? It's all the code switching, which is lots of fun to talk about and central. It's the central conceit of the whole book. But again, it's not as self-evidently easy as you might think. Obviously, there's incredibly offensive, problematic racial language. The N word is all over there. I think it's hard to imagine this novel being taught in a public high school in America at this moment. Maybe it would be, I don't know. Um, but it's obviously something some classrooms, it's not going to work in some classrooms. Maybe it'll work in others. Um, the anger, the explosive anger and violence that happens in the last chapters is powerful and effective and shocking. But also, maybe it goes off the rails. I don't know, but that's also just something that's a little hard to dance around. I think you have to sort of move into it very strategically, very carefully, so that students are thoughtful about it rather than just dismissing it or shutting it down or just being shocked, but letting that shut them down as well from analysis of what that works. Um, Obviously, it is a lot of fun for an English professor because of the intertextuality. Yeah. It's Shakespeare, it's Voltaire, it's I think the Brontes are mentioned. Yeah, it's all over the place. Frederick Douglass, you get people mentioned all over it. Lots of intertextuality. I have some thoughts on that later in this talk. Sometimes I think it's very helpful to sort of unpack the intertextuality with students, and sometimes I think it's a little distracting. Sometimes I think it buries students a little bit. This is a very philosophical novel. I think that can work with English majors. You know, then will that work with your students? Will that work with a lower level class? I don't. I had mixed success because of that issue. I think with different student expectations. Um, Also, it's sort of, as I said, foundational myth you're unpacking, and then it is graphic. There is, in particular, I'm not even thinking about the violence at the end, but in the middle there is all the rape scenes, which are, not sentimentalized at all. They are horrifying and heartbreaking, and our character is sort of helpless in the situation. And again, you don't want students to be caught by surprise by that. I don't know what your personal pedagogical policies are about, content warnings or just heads up or not, but or how you feel about that. But I think being students being caught by surprise by that is not usually going to open up good teaching opportunities. So that also is a challenge one has to be thoughtful about ahead of time. Um, the big issue, of course, in both of these works is the N word, which is all over the place, particularly in Huck Finn. I think it's 219 times. It occurs less frequently in James, but it's there. Um, I think again, you don't want students being caught by surprise. I think it should be addressed. Personally, I find it most helpful to address it. But just asking students how they feel about it is maybe that would work in your classroom. I've tried that, and some students are willing to bring their thoughts to the fore, and some are not. You might want to consider asking students to write down some of their concerns about the language of the book and to read it. And when the words are deployed in either of these novels, and sometimes they're deployed for very particular effect, and sometimes they're employed a little more loosely, I think. And sometimes there's great contextual value to that moment. Other times, maybe not. And we can think as a class, right, about how that works. What does it illustrate about the world? Um, and does the close reading of those passages help, or does it make things worse? Students might feel very differently, and that's hard. I mean, when else have you asked students, is close reading going to make things bad here? Um, but that's a worthwhile question, I think, in this novel, these novels. Um, so I want to show you one fun way I launch into my discussion of James, which is I talk to them just very briefly. I don't assume they have read anything he wrote. I don't assume they're familiar with his novel Erasure or that they are familiar with the film American Fiction. But I do show them just a 2-minute trailer, which I'd like to share here if the tech works. If not, it's not a big deal. Because it then helps us move into James as being, a novel that meets expectations for a Black author in a very particularly ironic, slippery way. So let's see. I'm just going to see if the little 2-minute video will go. Okay, let's cross our fingers, Lonnie. Here we go.
How did you come to write this book?
What really struck me was that too few books were about my people. Where are our stories? Where's our representation?
Would you give us the pleasure of reading an excerpt?
Yo, Sharonda, girl, you be pregnant again? If I is, Ray Ray is gonna be a real father this time around.
Your books are good, but they're not popular. Editors, they want a black book. They have a black book. I'm black. It's my book. You know what I mean. Look at what they published. Look at what they expect us to write. Just want to rub their noses in it. I'd be standing outside in the night. There'd be dads, rappers, crack. You said you wanted black stuff. That's black, right? I see what you're doing. You sold your book. No.
We believe Mr. Lee has written a bestseller.
It was a joke. The most lucrative joke you've ever told.
Now, is Stag a pseudonym?
Yeah, Mr. Lee can't use his real name.
Is this based on your actual life?
Yeah, you think some bitch ass college boy can come up with that shit?
No, I don't.
Can I ask what you were in for? Was it murder? You said that, not me.
They ran 300,000 copies. Your books change people's lives.
They're offering $4 million for the movie rights.
Yeah.
The dumber I behave, the richer I get. Not too far.
Stag Lee is still on the run from authorities.
You haven't done anything. It's not like they can arrest you. That did go back to not selling books.
Is it bad to cater to people's taste?
People want to love you, Mom. You should let them love all of you.
There's already so much buzz because of the movie deal.
Michael B. Jordan is circulating.
We want to put him on the cover in one of those scarves, I guess you would call them, tied around his head.
A do-rag?
Do-rag, that's it. Do-rag and a tank top with the muscles showing.
Somebody call the fire department.
Okay, well, thank you for indulging me for that. Later, maybe some of you can Q&A, can give me some of your thoughts about the film and if it's helpful. What I find this is nice is a little warm up for students when I'm moving into this because I can show them this and then we sort of can move in, segue into expectations about Black authors, about the fiction they might write, and then of course about James as a character and how he fulfills or doesn't fulfill expectations when he plays a particular role for a particular cultural moment, as this character in the film does. Um, Also, I can get a little mileage out of the fact, let's see if I'm trying to, let's see if I can get out here. There we go. There's actually, I don't know where it is right now, but a few months ago, there was a movie that was in the works for James. And supposedly Spielberg and Waititi are going to be producing and directing it. Um, I don't know much about film. I do not have real insights into this issue, but it's really the students can jump in on this. And again, it's it's a nice kind of warm up conversation. What kind of film do you envision this might be? Why do you think these directors? What kind of film will it be because of these directors? What's its role in popular culture? So again, it's a nice entry into the harder stuff to follow. I just wanted to throw that out there as sort of fun, thing. And the just the premise of the movie trailer also sort of gets us into the idea of the Black artist following both tenets of Black art and tropes of Black art, but also creating, something for themselves, which is of course a theme very relevant to James. I'm a little nervous. I'm talking fast. I'm going to give you a little resource here, which is I found there's some website called English with Ease. I do not know who those people are. I didn't see names of the people, but they had some really useful stuff. And I took a little blob from them about the different. They have lots of good discussion questions, but here they have little blurbs about the various philosophers and the Enlightenment era things. What I find is actually my students don't want to hear about a lecture on Voltaire. I sort of tried to give them 5 minutes on Voltaire, on Candide. They were not, it was not opening doors for them in any particular way. But the gist of it is really important and really interesting, right? And I think the takeaway is that having John Locke, having Voltaire, having characters from Voltaire's writing, in particular Cunegonde, um, is a way to get at the um, how one can own a kind of continental philosophy, one can own intellectual worlds, and yet maybe they're not really going to serve you, right? Everett has stated that these philosophers function as stand-ins for figures like Thomas Jefferson, who wrote All Men Are Created Equal while owning hundreds of enslaved people. And students can sort of get that very quickly. And knowing that you have Montesquieu, a couple of these people did talk a little bit of slavery per se, but in general, they were more in terms with the concept of liberty than the reality. And that, again, is that ironic? Is that just heartbreaking? And how would a black person in the 19th century sort of conceive of that? Is a great opening moment rather than getting caught up in each of these intertextual references, which again can be a little overwhelming. I found with my students at the more junior levels. Um, I think of the pencil I wrote at the bottom. I think that's an interesting, we can get a lot of mileage out of the role of the pencil in this novel and all the beautiful problems it brings up. But ultimately, the novel ends in violence. He sees that he's not going to write his way out of this problem. He's not going to philosophize his way out of these problems. They may give him a reason to see his own humanity, to recognize his own complexity as a reasoning, thinking, enlightenment subject. But the pencil's not going to save him. Um, and I draw this back myself. I'm less interested in Voltaire than I am in Frederick Douglass. And I'm a Douglass scholar. I teach a lot of Douglass. And one of the exciting things I like to work with when I teach Douglass is while we may famously fetishize as a culture the beautiful narratives about Douglass learning to read and write and becoming literate and the agonies he went through to learn to read and write and how he did that, and then how he found a kind of freedom through that. And that's a beautiful narrative. But he also spends multiple chapters talking about his physical struggle for survival, fighting the crap out of his overseer, Mr. Covey, and how it's a fight to the death. And that is where he becomes a free man. And so you have this sort of the paeans, the appreciation for the literacy narrative, and it's real and it's meaningful. But you also have the physical liberation that has to just crash through any sentimentalization of sort of liberation through literacy. And I see that worked out so powerfully here in this novel of James. But now, moving back to Huck Finn, and then we're going to step into some passages. Um, Huck Finn is a novel about charlatans and con men and liars. And that's why it's fun. That's why I think it just exploded the 19th century, where just sincerity and was sincerity and romantic sensibility and sentimentalism were the, standards of the day. And the, humor and unapologetic ridiculousness of the charlatans and liars and hucksters is sort of what fuels hucksters. There you go. Fuels the entire novel, right? And its movement. Yet, Jim, as a character, I'm going to be saying Jim to refer to the character in Huck Finn. I'll be saying James to refer to the character in the novel James, just if there's any confusion, which I get confused. Jim in Huck Finn is the one sincere person in Huckleberry Finn. And he's the one who can say, I loved you. You tricked me and that was cruel. I thought you were dead, or you were the only friend I've ever had. Jim is the only character really who just speaks straight with love and sincerity. And that's beautiful. It makes Jim, the moral hero of the book, no question. But it's more poignant. He's still belittled and mocked and ignored and just discarded toward the end, and his story is less and less central. So you get that one moment of sincerity. On the other hand, we shouldn't be surprised, therefore, that when you flip that book with the novel of James, and this is pretty easy to work out with students. This isn't a hard concept, right? You're going to have, he's not going to be sincere. That is the opposite of the kind of character he's going to be. And he's going to be a character who has a double identity throughout, or multifold identity that he will manipulate as need be. He is a con man. He is a charlatan. He is a liar. He is a huckster. He is a hustler. All those things to survive, as really any black enslaved person in the 19th century would sort of have to be in many ways. But so you get that sort of flip from the sincerity of his character in Huck Finn to the hustler of his character, who doesn't have room to be sincere right? In the world he lives in. And so that juxtaposition about fiction, about lying, about truth, again, that sort of hits both books and is a nice sort of warm up concept. So, I'd like to try to jump into a scene. Now, I know this is a webinar, so it's a little awkward because I don't quite know, Lonnie, how we can manage this, but I'll do my best. I know many of you got a chance to look at it ahead of time. And if you didn't, let's see if we can go a little slow. My thought was to we look at the scene together. If possible, I'd love if there's a little comment or something you could throw into chat about this scene. And then I'll share my thoughts. But I don't want to dominate it with my thoughts. So let me read it here. Now I can have a good look at you. And laws of me. Now remember, this is Aunt Sally speaking. She's a woman who is sort of greeting a young boy who happens to be Huck Finn. She thinks he's somebody else. She thinks he's a long lost nephew or something. And he's not quite sure this mistaken identity, who he is, but he's going to play along with it. He knows that it's a relative or someone who's expecting him. She said, "Oh, come here. Now I can have a good look at you and laws of me. I've been hungry for it a many and a many a time all these long years. And it's come at last. We've been expecting you a couple of days and more. What's kept you? Boat get aground? Yes'm. She, oh, don't say yes'm. Say Aunt Sally. Now, where'd she get aground? I didn't rightly know what to say because I didn't know whether the boat would be coming up the river or down. But I go a good deal on instinct, and my instinct said she would be coming up from down toward Orleans. That didn't help me much, though, for I didn't know the name of the bars, the sandbars, down that way. And I see I got to invent a bar or forget the name of the one we got aground on. Or now I struck an idea and fetched it out. Oh, it weren't the grounding. That didn't keep us back but a little. We blowed out a cylinder head. Good gracious, anybody hurt? No, I'm killed at Henward. Well, it's lucky because sometimes people do get hurt. All right. And when people talk about sort of the pivotal moments in Huck Finn, this isn't usually the scene they pull out. For me, however, for many years, this is almost, I would almost start with this passage, even though it's about, 70% into the book, 60% along in the book. But I guess my first question for anyone, if you can throw it into the chat, isn't like, what do you think of the passage, but is what questions would you ask students when they see this passage? What kind of scaffolding could you give them to sort of unpack what's happening in this? So I don't know if that works, Lonnie, if we can see the chat in any way to see any questions. Like, what would you ask a student here?
So I'm sure our attendees are working through this big question that you posed for us.
How would you? Yeah.
So
So
I'm going to share the Q&A in the chat.
yeah. So when there is something, Lonnie, maybe you could just read it to me because I can't be clicking around too much. It's a little disconcerting.
Got it.
So what would open this up for students? So I guess what I'm asking.
Susanna, this is Andrew Delbanco. Maybe I'll take a stab at this while we're waiting for other responses. I mean, I think this is a brilliant choice of a passage on your part. I mean, of a passage to open the book up for students. And it strikes me, I mean, there's so many things to ask them about. The casualness of the interaction between Aunt Sally and Huck comes to a kind of climax when Huck decides to report in response to her question, anybody hurt? No, ma'am. Killed a N-word. And then her response is lucky because sometimes people do get hurt.
And I see some people have hands up too now.
Yeah, well, okay, I'll be brief. I mean, it's such a good example of what you derive from the text by reading it closely. I mean, you could go through this and miss entirely the devastating, ironic indictment of Aunt Sally that Twain is packing into this. And it makes the point that the controversial word that's been the center of the storm about Huck Finn, on the one hand, it may be offensive to some readers that Twain uses it, but in that final sentence, he is completely devastating toward people who use it casually and make a distinction in their mind between a Black person and a human being. So you have Twain committing a sin and exposing the sin at the same time. So I just, all I wanted to say by way of reaction is I love that you've chosen this passage. And I think it's a great doorway into the book that opens up so many of the issues that you've already touched on.
Yeah, let me just quickly say, I've just discovered apparently the chat is disabled.
Oh,
Um,
well, I
for
see Kendra has her hand up.
But Kendra has her hand up, and Kendra, you should be able to just, use the audio for your question. And there are also questions being directed to the Q&A. So Kendra, why don't you go ahead?
Can you hear me?
Mhm.
Okay, good. I was just, weighing in to say the chat was disabled, so we couldn't respond that way. But that is actually one of my favorite passages in the book. And when I teach the book, that's one of the ones that I always point to because I think you mentioned earlier the 219, 220 instances of the N word in the book. And I think that that is the one that points out how intentional Twain is in his use of the N word, that it's not just he's peppering it sort of willy-nilly because that's the way people spoke. He's using it quite intentionally. And so I agree with what the previous speaker said. And I just wanted to point out the chat was disabled, so none of us could type what we thought. So that's all.
Thank you. Lonnie, is there anything in the Q&A I should be aware of?
So there are some really interesting questions from attendees. And I just wanted to say quickly, I believe the chat is now available to everyone. So let's maybe experiment there. So some really good questions. Are people for Aunt Sally interchangeable? She doesn't know one nephew from a stranger. What does that say about how she views people?
Ooh, that's a good one. I never thought about that one. That'd be
I have-
great for students.
Yeah, yeah. Now my recollection is that she hadn't met this particular nephew yet, but
For
thinking that
years.
Um, now, does part of Huck's instinct involve playing on someone else's dehumanization of enslaved people? And then a question around how do different characters define humanity? What does it mean to be human?
Oh, I love that. That could really get us some good mileage with undergraduates as well, I think. Yeah, no, I've taught this scene a lot, and it's wonderful, and it puts the N word, in the center of the discussion. And clearly, when you can tease it out pretty quickly, we see the monstrosity of Aunt Sally, right? And that's important. I think that's one of Twain's genius things, right? Is that the face of evil is this sweet, loving woman, right? It doesn't need to be a Simon Legree from Uncle Tom's Cabin whipping somebody, right? It's the sweet person who, on the other hand, we later know, if she were to find out Jim were a fugitive, she would immediately turn him over to the law because she's a good person and that's what you do. And so seeing the monstrousness in this character is useful. And so it opens up irony. Right here, we have the obvious irony of the expectation of the language versus the humanity of the characters. Also, I think, and this is a little more technical about comparing it with James. Um, in James has a internally fluid internal standardized English interior monologue, but his external speaking is almost always in dialect. That's right. And here, but actually, you realize that Huck too, he speaks very differently from how he thinks internally. And that's sort of also a fun little parallel. But what I really want to get at, and I think one of the Q&A questions there was leading me there a little bit, sorry, is they they can usually get to Aunt Sally's racism and inhumanity, but the harder part is teasing out the role of Huck Finn in that. We see that Huck Finn is saying the language that is expected of him, but boy, he fits really easily into that role, isn't he? He's really good at that. Um, that's not something to be laughed at. Like, what does it mean to be really good at slipping into that monstrous behavior? And is he acting or is he speaking in his own voice? And either of those is a problem. And then, but he has sort of plausible deniability, right? There's a lot of plausible deniability about bad things that happen that we can say are not Huck's fault. And I think this is an interesting one. So it unsettles the author. I mean, yeah, the author is showing us with intentionality the problem of that word, but that doesn't mean we have to feel good and confident and happy about how Twain is deploying this and the stakes and the loss of, the cruelty of these characters. So it's not, there's one level we can take it to with the irony. But then I'm still unsettled by it. And I think still being unsettled is always a good place to land with students. Let's try another passage. Here we go. Now this is a bit longer, but similarly, I'd be interested if you could throw into Q&A, not questions you have about the scene, but maybe questions you might use for students to sort of scaffold a classroom moment. Now, when I read this, I've tried and it didn't go well getting students to try to read it because that way you get the rhythm of a minstrel show, you get the back and forth of conversational fun. But students are often hesitant because of the dialect that's in here. They'll read it sort of flat and you lose a lot of the humor. And then some of them are uncomfortable taking on Jim's voice at all if they're a white student. And there's a lot of awkwardness. One thing I've gotten around is I've had a student read the Huck Finn lines and I'll try to sort of read the Jim lines in order to get a sense of a dialogue. So, why Huck? Don't the French people talk the same way we does? No, Jim, you couldn't understand a word they say, not a single word. Well, now, I be ding busted. How did that come? Well, I don't know, but it's so. I got some of their jabber out of the book. Suppose a man was to come to you and say, Polly-voo Franzi, what would you think? I wouldn't think nothing. I'd take and bust him over the head. That is, if he weren't white. I wouldn't allow no N-word to call me that. Shucks, it ain't calling you anything. It's only saying, do you know how to talk French? Well, then why couldn't he say it? Why, he is saying it. That's a Frenchman's way of saying it. Well, it's a blame ridiculous way, and I don't want to hear no more about it. There ain't no sense in it. Looky here, Jim. Does a cat talk like we do? No, cat don't. Well, does a cow? No, cat don't nother. Does a cat talk like a cow, or a cow talk like a cat? No, they don't. It's natural and right for them to talk with each other from it, ain't it? Of course. And ain't it natural and right? Sorry, actually, my screen was blocked. And ain't it natural and right for a cat and a cow to talk different from us? Why, most surely it is. Well, then, why ain't it natural and right for a Frenchman to talk different from us? You answer me that. Is a cat a man, Huck? No. Well, then there ain't no sense in a cat talking like a man. Is a cow a man or is a cow a cat? No, she ain't either of them. Well, then she ain't got no business to talk like either one or the other of them. Now, is a Frenchman a man? Yes. Well, then that blame it, why don't he talk like a man? You answer me that. I see it weren't no use wasting words. You can't learn an N word to argue. So I quit. All right. So I'd love to see, is there anyone in the chat? What would you do with this in a classroom? How can you sort of scaffold questions to get students to get at there's the funny stuff, but what are the stakes? What are the issues? How do we pull it out for students? I don't mind taking a minute here. It's a hard passage and it's a hard thing to teach. What might you ask a student who's encountering this? I can't really see anything in the Q&A or the chat, Lonnie. So if there's anything, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. I see something appeared.
Yes, something has come in. I think attendees are processing.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It is a lot. So one potential question to pose for students is what assumptions do we have about language capability and its connection to intelligence? And of course, as you were saying, right, there's so much that James is doing in the novel with the code switching. And I'm sure there's also more to say about that.
Yeah, no, I hadn't even gone at it like that. I really appreciate that. Yeah. What is the assumption about intelligence? This opens up all the code switching in James conversations. And what I always try to use with my students, and believe me, the first couple of days they look blank, although they get better. When I start, what are the stakes? Like what's at the heart? There's something at stake here for Jim that's much, much bigger than for Huck. Huck thinks he's talking about French, right? And how people in the world speak different languages and Jim is uneducated and doesn't know that. Um, and maybe Jim's example, Huck's examples for how that work with animals is dopey, but that's sort of the basic concept Huck is operating from. From Jim, he's talking about humanity itself. Like, what is it to be human? And Jim lives in a world that doesn't see him as fully human. He's a machine for capital. And so the stakes are deeply different. And though the jokes can go in sort of either directions, um, I think also there's a lot to do, and it's hard because it's those last two lines, but where everything collapses in on itself, and Huck cannot say anything back. He loses a way to speak with Jim, um, and you realize they're still they come from a world where they can't quite understand each other yet. So it's funny. And when I teach both Huck Finn and when I teach James, this is where you want to give a lecture on minstrelsy and you want to show them a scenes from Bamboozled, the Spike Lee movie, or you want to show them, documentaries that what's a wonderful documentary, Ethnic Notions that I mentioned toward the end, where it gives you all the cultural historical context. And that's really important for both these books. But if you don't have time for all that, like just jumping into scenes like this that are, the big comic scenes that don't have much to do with the plot, but they have everything to do with the plot, right? You can tease out what makes Jim human, what matters to him here. Um, Ultimately, they can see it's not about education, it's about humanity. It takes a while to unpack though, but thank you. Was there any other comments in the chat or the Q&A there?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
So two really great questions posed by attendees to get students thinking about this scene. What does it mean to talk like a man? And
Right there, 100% right there. Yeah.
right. And then a really nice comment from, I see William White in the chat. I'd play a debate game and have one table defend Huck and one table defend
Ooh.
Jim.
Oh,
Right.
I
And,
love
and
it.
here I think this is key. The instructor chooses the speaker from each table to stand and defend the position I gave.
No, I like that because they're both
Right?
indefensible, right? They're both ridiculous in logic, but oh, I really love that too because so many debate things depend on logic. They don't depend on social, cultural, emotional truths. And that sort of takes that standard debate exercise, but it shows how we in the humanities do something that's not about logical argumentation, right? And our definition of that is much broader and messier and harder and more beautiful, right? Because more is at stake and when we have those discussions. I love that activity. Okay. We're not going to do all the scenes. I think I'm going to skip the the pray a lie thing. I want to go to a scene from James. So let's look at the scene from James. I'll read it again. If you could think, what questions would you ask students to open up this passage? This is on like page 3 of the novel. Sadie shaved off a sliver and put it in her mouth. I swear that woman has a talent for not cooking. Do I have to eat it? Lizzie asked. No, you don't, Sadie said. But what are you going to say when she asks you about it? I asked. Lizzie cleared her throat. Miss Watson, that's some cornbread like I never before ate. Try dat be, I said. That would be the incorrect grammar. Dat be some a cornbread like never I ate, she said. Very good, I said. There are 1,000 scenes where he's moving in and out of standard English. There's a beautiful long scene where he's really teaching the children at great length. This is sort of an encapsulation of that little teaching moment. But yeah, so how would you use this in a classroom? What questions would you ask students? So I know I think I know how we would all unpack this, but how would you get students to do the work? How might you get students to do something with this? It's a very approachable little scene, right? I mean, coming only in the third page of the entire novel, you know it's giving us material to carry us through for the rest of the book. I see one or two, I think maybe came in there, Lonnie.
Yes, okay. Who has developed the structure of the correct, incorrect grammar?
Ooh. Yeah, I could see students being having a moment with that question, which is exactly the best kind of question. It's when they have to take a second there. Yeah, is it? Yeah, who create? That's a good opening. That's
Yeah,
great.
and another suggestion, does how you say it matter as much as what you say?
Mhm.
In the chat, I see Kendra suggests that ask students to define code switching and consider times in their lives when they deploy it, and then to consider the life or death stakes of the situation these characters are facing.
What I like about all these is that they're not they're not heavy-handed leading questions. They are actually genuine, like, I don't know. I'm not, I don't know exactly the answer to those, which is always the best kind of questions. We ask both kinds of questions. And sometimes you want a very leading question because you want to go to a particular place, and sometimes it is genuinely a baffling moment and you want to see where they're going to run with it. And I think those questions address both. Um, Obviously, it's an easy entry into the code switching, right? Or James himself uses the phrase slave filter, which might be a fun thing to, tease out with the kids. But why is it a teaching scene, right? Why isn't we've seen him switching? So why do we have to? I mean, this would be a scene. I don't have the answer. I would ask students, but why is it a pedagogy moment? Why can't he just say, "Oh, well, we just quickly pick up how to go back and forth between those codes," instead of having like a schoolyard, thing? Why is that moment? And I think if you remember, there's a strange and quiet little moment in Huck Finn, which I think is overshadowed by a lot of Huck Finn drama, where again, it's a moment of sincerity, which has nothing to do with the plot, really, where Jim is feeling sad about his family and turns to Huck Finn. Huck Finn suddenly aware that Jim has a family. He's never thought about the fact that Jim has a family before. Jim, not only does Jim say, I have a family, he said, I have a little daughter and she's deaf. And I didn't realize it. And I yelled at her to close the door and she didn't close the door. And I yelled and yelled at her. And then I realized, oh my gosh, the poor baby is deaf. And what does it have to do with Jim's freedom? What does that anecdote have to do with his slavery? What does that anecdote have to do with Jim's motivations? And it takes a while for students to really grapple with that. It's Jim's humanity. It's Jim's uh, family is freedom to Jim, not being on a dumb raft. And that's played out, in James very much so, right? And James deeply aware of his family. His family is everything. And here we see the teaching scene, the child, so there's a nice parallel to that deaf scene, the deaf child revelation. That you see in Huck Finn and that sort of moment. It's also a good moment to walk them through reading dialect. I teach a lot of fiction. Any of you 19th century Americanists who are with me, you know what I'm talking about. There's a lot of dialect fiction in the 19th century writing, and sometimes black dialect, sometimes ethnic dialect. I teach a lot of Charles Chestnut, so I think about dialect a lot because he's an African American writer who specializes in thoughtful, clever dialect fiction. And one just little tip I have for both these books is it helps to read aloud. I encourage my students to maybe listen to audiobooks. Some of them, their eyes almost have trouble when they see all the dialogue. Maybe they're not that experienced readers with a big novel anyway, and to suddenly have the dialogue, even if it's, shall we say, ironic, fake dialect that is being put on by the character James, it can be a reading challenge. And I think it's helpful for professors to be aware of that and to not dismiss it as unsophisticated and actually show strategies. Again, one strategy I have is often sounding it aloud or reading it aloud. Suddenly things can fall into place. So when teaching both of these books, I think I read aloud more than I would in a lot of other novels that I teach. So that's another sort of door to think about. Okay, let's do one more passage here. Um, let's see. Let's see. Oh, let's do this one. Okay. Um, this is a short one. So this is in James. It's a pretty funny scene. I like it. Huck has gone away on shore having some adventure, and we don't know exactly what went down, but he comes back and he tells about a feud between these white folks, the Shepherds and the Grangerfords. And now in the novel, Huck Finn, that's like 3 chapters of the book. It's a very big deal and it's very sad and upsetting. Huck actually sees a boy, his friend, a white kid, get shot in the head in front of him. I mean, it's genuinely traumatic. It's genuinely full of great seriousness. Although played to some comedy, this feud, but and the violence, the irrational violence, it's an important scene. Here it's off stage. He just comes on the boat and he tells Jim about it. Huck told me the story of the feuding Shepherdsons and Dangerfords with much relish, about the ongoing battle between the families, about how he'd been taken in. Exhausted, I listened without much interest. So, um, what would you do with students with this? What question could you ask to open up something interesting with this passage? While you're chewing it, I'll say one of the things I work with students is why is James not interested? Now they'll say it's a long, confusing story. It has no plot implications for James. Um, it's very meaningful in Huck Finn, but and it's about meaningless violence. But here, James is recentered, right? It's James's story is key. We realize these offstage events are not so important, but it also reminds you between of the endless violence. Who's going to control the storytelling? And we think of Huck as the great storyteller, and he's not in this novel. So it's a nice way to unpack some of those about again intertextuality about I don't know everything from Waiting for Godot, right, and intertextuality in that sense. But whose story is interesting to who gets to frame the entire thing. So a couple more quick thoughts, and then we can wrap up here. I know I'm over the time. Um, Let's see. I recommend a documentary called called Ethnic Notions. I have a couple of little links there. I'm sure we can make these. You can easily Google it. And that I've used clips of it with students because it really helps some of the 19th century stereotypes. Also, a novel which I think is so in conversation with this book, which I have not heard raised in most of the criticism and discussion of James out there in the critic sphere, is Middle Passage by Charles Johnson, which is a fantastic novel. It won a National Book Award some 30 years ago. And it's a comic neo-slave novel, very philosophical, about a free black man who becomes a sailor on a Middle Passage ship. And I know, hard to believe that is a comic novel, but it is. It's brilliant. It teaches really well. And it's very much about contemporary philosophy and 19th century philosophy. And so I very much see Middle Passage in sort of a strange and beautiful conversation with James. So that's just another one I want to throw out as a resource. Now my final, this is my last slide here, is James and Huck Finn are I don't know what it's going to be like teaching them this coming year. I'm not teaching them this semester. I'm not sure about next semester. Um, on one hand, I've read people assessing James as a backlash against wokenism. Somehow, it's an anti-woke book. In some ways, it's a woke book. In some ways, I wonder if it's a backlash to a backlash. So I guess in the Q&A, if any of you have thoughts that you could toss in, because I don't know how to teach this. Gingerly would be my only guiding phrase, how to teach these things at this moment. But again, I think that's what makes them important, is makes them hard to navigate in a classroom. But I hope that if we approach it with respect and love and humor with one another, that we can get somewhere interesting with each other. So thank you for your patience for riding all those rapids with me. Thanks.